Hello, and welcome to HMR 1, Week 9, Lecture 3, where we'll explore the relationship between human rights and refugees. And in many ways, the refugee is someone most in need of human rights without any right to have them. And we talked briefly about that idea when we introduced the backpack of human rights, and that's one of the main concepts of Hannah Arendt, but also a key component of the modern human rights idea, that human rights exist to fill the gap, especially for refugees, between the rights one might have and enjoy as a citizen and the rights one might need when one is alienated from your state, when one is deracinated from your state, when one is pushed outside your country. Your rights as a human being is guaranteed by humanity itself to have rights. So, the rights of refugees, the human rights of refugees, but also what is a refugee, what rights a refugee enjoys under international human rights and humanitarian law, and how to prevent people from becoming refugees in the first place are key elements of the contemporary human rights idea, and something we do a lot of work on here at UC Davis in our human rights courses, both on the undergraduate and graduate level, and indeed what some of our research looks at. And I'll be sharing with you some of that after the end of today's lecture. So we looked at on the in the pre-lecture period, we looked at a map, a graphic from the High Commissioner for Refugees, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and his office, talking about or explaining where many refugees come from, what countries are hosting them, and then how many are being resettled. So we're going to think a little bit about that process, about the definition of refugee, about the origins of the contemporary refugee regime, and some of the contemporary challenges it faces as we continue to see a world in which refugees are becoming more and more of they've never not been, but are becoming so much a part of our contemporary world. So, the refugee. The word refugee is a very powerful word, but it has a very specific definition. And a definition that under international human rights and humanitarian law, but also practice that has evolved over the last century. And the refugee idea, or the idea of what is a refugee, has a great deal to do with some of the same circumstances that led to the creation of the Genocide Convention, as well as the need to create the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so the first time the international community became engaged in helping refugees was in the period immediately after the First World War, with the establishment of what was called the Nansen Passport. And the Nansen Passport was named for a guy named Sigvard Nansen, who was a fish neurobiologist. Yes, such a thing exists, from Norway, who had also been a great polar explorer. And he's a great bear of a man with a big beard, and he had been asked by the League of Nations, which you all know as the precursor to the United Nations, to try to figure out a way to help displaced Armenian and Russian refugees in the wake of genocide in the Ottoman Empire, but also the Bolshevik Revolution, the revolution that brought to power the communists and established the Soviet Union in what was Russia and is again Russia. And so he developed for them what was called, which was a travel document, a kind of passport that defined refugees in a very narrow way. And the refugee under that regime was defined as someone who had lost their nationality, who had been denationalized, and had no access to a state. And that passport, which was really only reserved for Armenians and Russians, established a key international principle, key human rights idea, which is that when you cross borders and you seek refuge, you cannot be returned somewhere where you might be killed. And that's called the principle of non refoulement, or non-refoulement, R-E, non, right, dash, refoulement, non-refoulement. And the Nansen passports, as they came to be called, were extremely useful for those populations because they had been systematically denationalized by their home countries. And in this case, it means legislation, actual laws were passed in Russia and in Turkey that said that if, Armenians and Russian refugees, if they're not in the country now, they have been denied their citizenship. Now, as you might imagine, the Nansen passport, because it was so limited to a certain category of people, had real limitations. And in the period between World War I and World War II, that meant that other communities of people, in particular the Jews of Europe, could not use the Nansen passport to emigrate. So if you were someone like Hannah Arendt, whom we talked about before, who lost your rights in a de facto way because you were a Jew living in Germany, you couldn't hold a job in a university, you couldn't hold a civil service job, your ability to move capital across international borders, for all intents and purposes, you'd been denationalized. But the state hadn't officially done it to you, you had no access to a Nansen passport. And so with the murder of several million Jews and others in the interwar period, and then the displacement of even more during the war, when the international community sort of regained its footing in the period after the Second World War and began to think about how to bring the human rights idea more firmly into the practice of supporting refugees, they began to switch the thinking of what defines a refugee away from this notion of denationalization as being the sole reason for refugee status to a series of questions or a series of conditions that really revolved around the individual's relationship to human rights abuses. And that's seen in the 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees. And that's something I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about here. Convention relating to the status of refugees. So, World War II in Europe has ended. Countries are being occupied. The Soviet Union is occupying much of Eastern Europe. There are populations have been shifting around from Eastern Europe to Central Europe. There was an entire sort of class of Eastern European slave laborers who had been nearly worked to death in Nazi Germany, many of whom did not want to go back to the Soviet Union or to Eastern Europe, but rather to try to seek refuge in the West. You had large numbers of deported people from newly drawn borders in Poland and Ukraine. You also had large numbers of the German diaspora in Eastern Europe being pushed out of countries that they had lived in some cases, for many hundreds of years. And so Europe was filled, and then of course you had Jews who had suffered in the Holocaust, who had survived, who did not want to return to Germany or those countries that had persecuted them, but sought refuge or emigration to Israel or to the United States or the Western Hemisphere. And so Europe was, I don't want to use this word lightly, but awash in a way, with movements of people displaced who had nowhere to go. There was no system. The countries of Europe had been devastated by the war. And so the United Nations, operating on some key human rights principles, as outlined in the Universal Declaration, said, we have to solve this refugee problem. So let's figure out how to do it. And they looked at the Nansen technique and they thought, that's just not going to work. We have to come up with a different definition of refugee and a different process of resettlement. So the Convention relating to the status of refugees creates a definition of the refugee, something relatively new, or actually quite new under international human rights law, that turns not on the question of denationalization, which was no longer particularly relevant, but rather on this concept of a well-founded fear of persecution. So let me just read to you the definition, and we will have a chance to sort of parse it after I do so. Convention relating to the status of refugees. May I have some tea first? As a result of events occurring before 1 January 1951, and owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, is outside the country of his nationality and is unable or, owing to such fear, is unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country, or who, not having a nationality and being outside the country of his former habitual residence, as a result of such events, is unable or owing to such fear, is unwilling to return to it. All right. That's one sentence, right? So this is, diplomatic speak, it's legalese, we have to sort of go through it. So let's look at the first clause. As a result of events occurring before 1 January 1951. That's when this convention goes into place, right? And the members of that convention, the states that agreed to it were the states of Europe primarily, as well as the United States in a way. It subscribed to it, but it was not one of the original signatories. But for example, the countries of the British Commonwealth. So as a result of events occurring before January 1951, so looking backwards, and owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted. Now, the historic understanding of why you might seek asylum, right? And the word and asylum, the concept of asylum is integrally linked to the concept of refugee. You, as a refugee, you are seeking asylum, and you have that right in the under the Universal Declaration. So you're seeking asylum, and historically, you would seek asylum because you were being persecuted. Your life was being threatened because of your religious beliefs or your political beliefs, or in the case of more modern cases, because of your ethnicity or your color. So persecution sits at the very center of the modern definition of the refugee. So owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, is outside the country of his nationality. In other words, you have left your country, and you have done so because of this fear, right? Because your race has been targeted, your religion has been targeted, you're a member of a political party that's on the outs, or you're a member of a social group that's on the outs. Owing to such fear, is unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country. In other words, you no longer count on your home country to provide to you the kinds of protections, civilian protections, that we come to expect with being a citizen. Even though you have all these, you could be of a different race or religion than the majority, it doesn't mean you necessarily fear that the state won't protect you. In fact, that's what good modern states are supposed to do. Uphold people's basic human rights, and you don't have to worry about fear of persecution. But in the absence of that, individuals fearing that they will be persecuted and believing that they cannot return because they will be killed, right, can seek protection elsewhere. So unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country, or who, not having a nationality and being outside of the country of his former habitual residence as a result of such events, in other words, this is mostly talking about the events of the Second World War, is unable or owing to such fear, unwilling to return. In other words, you've left your country. You're afraid to go back because you will face persecution on the basis of one of these characteristics. And if this is the case, if you're able to demonstrate that your fear is well-founded, and of course that's subjective, if your fear is well-founded, then you are a refugee. and you're entitled to certain kinds of protections. Now, I'm gonna kind of move the story forward a little bit to note the slight change of the Refugee Convention in 1967, and then return to talk about what it means to be designated a refugee under this convention. So, 1951, the convention sort of existed to try to sort out and solve the problems of the Second World War, and to a large extent, by a decade later, 1960, it really had. It really had. By 1960, there were no more IDP camps or internally displaced or displaced person camps in Europe. Everyone needing a home had a home. Everyone seeking to emigrate had been able to emigrate. And in fact, I showed you the wonderful Superman comic, which shows a young Hungarian refugee being sort of protected, if you will, by Superman, and the young boys taunting him are sort of educated on the conditions that refugees face. I'm always very moved by that, right? Because of course Superman was a refugee, right? So in 1967, however, and we're talking, the great decade of decolonization, which we've, of course, talked about earlier. Again, there was a great need for the creation of protections for refugees. So, in 1967, the United Nations, with a very new membership, right, after 1960, revisited the 1951 Convention in what's called the 1967 Protocol. And so the 1967 Protocol opens up the 1951 definition and removes any temporal or geographic limitations. In other words, the definition of refugee and the conditions which are supposed to apply to refugees is no longer based solely on being in geographic Europe and having been made a refugee before 1951, but could be anywhere in the world and at any time. And this protocol has 146 state parties to it. In other words, 146 countries around the world have signed on to this treaty and have integrated into their national law, including the United States. So what does it mean to be designated a refugee by the UNHCR? And we'll look after I complete my lecture on the process of resettlement. So first and foremost, what it means is you have the right to be resettled, and where you are resettled, you are entitled to the best rights or the best treatment reserved for any non-national of that country. So that's sort of complex. Let me just explain it this way. Those of you familiar with U.S. immigration, which are many of you, know that there's a kind of a status that we used to nickname a green card, right? You had a green card, which meant that you were considered under United States law a resident alien. In other words, that you lived in the United States, you paid taxes in the United States, you could move anywhere, own property. You had every rights all the rights of a U.S. citizen, with the exception that you couldn't vote and other limitations. But you were even expected to serve in the military if you were called upon. So a legal resident alien, right, has this status. And so when refugees would come to the United States, they were automatically given that status. Okay. So this was a way to, it's a recognition of the global need to facilitate the resettlement of those people who could never go home, right? To solve that problem, because refugees are present a human rights challenge, right? But they also tend to have destabilizing characteristics as well. Right? It's not their fault. So the Refugee Convention has been in place now since 1951 regionally in Europe, but since 1967, well over 50 years globally. And many millions of people have been resettled under that protocol, including hundreds of thousands of people who have been brought to the United States in that period, millions of people actually. And what's interesting, the US, of course, used to bring in about between 150 and 250,000 people a year under Republican administrations, Democratic administrations. But under President Trump, that number was reduced most recently to 14,000 people. Sweden takes in 3 times as many people, for example. Presumably that will change. All right, so the convention establishes the responsibility of states to take care of refugees. Now, what causes people to become refugees? That's the next question, right? We talked about fear of persecution. In general, war creates refugees. 90% of all the world's refugees, if not more, are created through conflict, right? War happens. And the hope is that when these wars end, many of those communities go home. But that's not always been the case. And the population of California, in many ways, has been shaped by the outcome or by many of these refugee-producing wars. So, for example, the Vietnamese population, Vietnamese American population of California, which is really sizable, was created in part because of 30 years of war in Southeast Asia, some of which the United States participated in, which created over 3 million refugees. The population of California has also been shaped by the Soviet-Afghan War, which created 6.3 million refugees who have settled here. In Iraq, in South Sudan, Central Africa, California is a place where many people fleeing these conflicts have found safety and refuge here under normal circumstances. But there are other elements that push people into refuge, and that includes political persecution, right, for your beliefs. And you had a chance, one of the films that we showed earlier this quarter, Born in Evin Prison, was about political persecution, right? You also have, for example, someone like Ismail Beya, who, it's because of war, but also because his circumstances would suggest that he was continually vulnerable to forms of exploitation. Although I don't know specifically on what basis Ismail Beya emigrated to the United States. So political persecution, religious persecution are also elements in addition to war. So as I conclude, what are some of the weaknesses and missing elements of the refugee regime? So here's a question. Is fleeing economic collapse a basis for becoming a refugee? In other words, your country's economy is collapsing, like Venezuela, things are becoming too expensive to buy, you're having lots of problems feeding your family, having access to medical care. It is utterly miserable and terrible and inhumane. And the answer there, unfortunately, is under international law, as I and others currently understand it, you would not be considered a refugee, even though you're facing terrible circumstance, right, and terrible human rights violations because of it. You would be considered what I think was often dismissively, a term that's often dismissively used as an economic migrant. And this is often also the condition that's applied to, say, Guatemalan or other Central American immigrants seeking asylum in the United States who may claim that they're being persecuted by gangs or they're being extorted, but their claims can be easily dismissed at the border or by American judges as not having to do with actual fears of persecution, right? But rather being targeted by criminal gangs. I mean, it's a difference without a distinction from my perspective, but under the law, asylum is not warranted. So this is one of the key weaknesses of the of the refugee regime, is that it doesn't seem to have the flexibility to acknowledge that there are other factors that create people who look like refugees, act like refugees, and have the basic human rights needs of refugees. And so that weakness is really one of the reasons why there's some calls to re-examine the 1951 Convention and rewrite it. But there's equally other calls or to say no. The 1951 Convention is a very strong and very useful tool for refugee protection. And if we go in and try to revise it, what will come out will never be as strong and never be as useful. Because just like genocide, just like human rights, the Refugee Convention has the capacity to ask of states or to demand of states that they surrender some of their absolute sovereignty, right? That they share sovereignty, if you will, with the international community and accept these refugees as part of that process. So I'll conclude now. And what I'd like to do is share with you a graphic showing the process of becoming a refugee and coming to the United States, following the story of a family from Syria, to San Diego, and then also share with you some of the ongoing refugee projects and support projects that we're doing here at UC Davis that I hope some of you might consider taking part in. Thank you.